Hi friends, welcome. Here we are discussing real stories told by real people. Today we have a story about a man who, working as a traffic police officer, stopped a car in which his wife was sitting with her lover. Let's see what happens. Suddenly the door opened. Emily came in, her eyes red with tears. She was wearing a simple dress. Her hair was disheveled. "Garrett," she began, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." Garrett stood up from his chair, his face set in stone. "What's to talk about, Emily?" "What is it?" he asked coldly. "You've already said everything with your actions." Emily took a step towards him, her hands trembling. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "I made a terrible mistake. Please give me another chance." Garrett clenched his fists, trying to contain his anger. "Do you call this a mistake?" He spat out. "You betrayed me, Emily. She betrayed our promises, our dreams." Tears flowed down Emily's cheeks. "I love you, Garrett," she begged. "We can get over this. Please don't leave me." Garrett turned away, unable to look at her. Emily sobbed, her shoulders shaking. "It's not what you think," she began, but Garrett interrupted her. Emily fell to her knees, her arms reaching out to him. "Please, Garrett, give me a chance. I will do everything to fix it." A few hours before that. It was a typical Thursday evening. Garrett was patrolling the streets in his police car. He was a tall man with short dark hair and green eyes, his face reflecting determination and experience. Suddenly he noticed a silver sedan with a broken taillight. He turned on the siren and stopped the car on the side of the road. After getting out of the patrol car, Garrett walked over to the driver's window, his hand resting habitually on his pistol holster. The window slowly rolled down, and Garrett felt an unpleasant premonition. The driver turned out to be a well-dressed man in his 40s with dark hair and light stubble. A woman sat next to him in the passenger seat with a panicked expression on her face. It was Emily. Her long brown hair was pulled back in a careless bun, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Good evening, officer," the man said nervously. Garrett swallowed, his throat dry. "Sir, I stopped you because of a broken taillight. Can I see your license and registration?" The man handed over the documents with shaking hands. Garrett glanced at the name on the driver's license. Julian Park. He saw his wife Emily in the seat next to him, and his voice turned cold. "What's the matter with him?" "What is it?" he asked, looking her straight in the eye. Emily opened her mouth, but Julian interrupted her. "She's my girlfriend," he replied. Emily silently begged Garrett with her eyes, asking for forgiveness, but he couldn't meet her gaze. He entered Julian's data into the onboard computer. His movements were mechanical and automatic. "Here's your ticket for the broken taillight," Garrett said, handing back the documents. "We'll talk later," he added, not looking at Emily. Julian nodded, his face pale. "Thank you, officer," he muttered. Garrett stepped back and watched the sedan drive away, leaving him alone on the side of the road. His world collapsed in an instant. Later that night, Garrett sat in the living room of their cozy home, staring at a wedding photo with Emily. Her happy smile now seemed like a mockery to him. A storm was boiling in his heart. The front door opened and Emily walked in. Her eyes were red from crying, and her face was pale. "Garrett, I'm so sorry," she began. "It was a mistake. Please give me another chance." Garrett stood up, his face like a stone. "Do you love me?" he said, his voice trembling with suppressed anger. "Is that what you're telling your boyfriend?" Emily flinched as if she'd been hit. "It's not what you think," she tried to explain, but Garrett cut her off harshly. "I don't care," he said. "You've made your choice, and this choice was not in my favor." Emily took a step toward him, her hands shaking. "Please, Garrett, we can fix this. I'll do anything." Garrett turned away, his heart turning cold. "No," he said, "you have to leave." Emily fell to her knees, her body shaking with sobs. "Where should I go? What is it?" she asked, her voice filled with despair. "I don't care," Garrett replied without looking at her. "Just get out of my house." It was a long and painful night. Garrett couldn't sleep, his thoughts darting between waves of sadness and outbursts of rage. He couldn't believe that the woman he loved could betray him like that. The next morning, Emily left. She left behind only a suitcase with her belongings and a crumpled note of apology. Garrett stared at that pathetic piece of paper, feeling his heart being torn to pieces. Garrett was sitting at the kitchen table, his face grim and focused. Emily's laptop was in front of him. She had left him in a hurry, and now he was the key to uncovering her infidelity. Garrett knew he had to gather evidence. His hands were shaking with tension as he turned on the computer. Emily was always neat and organized. She worked in a small firm as an accountant. Garrett knew he would find everything he needed on her device. He started with her mailbox. The password was simple, and Garrett soon gained access. He found a lot of letters from Julian in his mailbox. These letters revealed their lengthy correspondence. "I love you, Julian," Emily wrote. "I can't wait to meet you." Garrett felt everything boiling inside him. He continued to search. He soon found the photos. The pictures showed Emily and Julian together at romantic dinners, in parks, and on the beach. Her smile when she looked at Julian was full of happiness. Garrett realized how deeply she had betrayed their marriage. He picked up the phone and called his friend Mark. Mark was a cybersecurity expert. Garrett knew he would need help. "Hi, Mark," Garrett said, trying to keep his voice even. "I need your help. I found something on Emily's laptop." Mark sighed. "I get it, Garrett. Come to my place. We'll figure it out." Garrett collected all the evidence he found. He wrote them down on a USB stick and drove to Mark's. They met at Mark's house, a cozy house with bookshelves full of technical literature. "Show me," Mark said, pointing at the table. Garrett handed him the flash drive. "All the letters and photos are there," he said. "I want you to help me find more." Mark nodded. "No problem, Garrett. We'll find everything we need." They spent several hours going through the data. Mark helped Garrett hack Emily's social media accounts, Instagram, Facebook, and they found a lot of messages and photos that confirmed her infidelity. "It's terrible," Mark said, looking through the photos. "I don't understand how she could do that." Garrett stared at the screen, his face expressionless. "She betrayed me, Mark, and I have to find out the whole truth." There has always been love and trust in their relationship with Emily. Garrett loved her with all his heart. But now that trust has been shattered, he could feel a cold determination growing inside him. When they were done, Garrett took the flash drive with the collected evidence. "Thank you, Mark," he said, shaking his friend's hand firmly. "You've helped me a lot." Mark nodded. "Take care of yourself, Garrett. It's hard, but you can handle it." Garrett returned home holding a USB flash drive. He knew that he had gathered enough evidence. But new challenges awaited him ahead. Garrett was sitting at his computer in a dimly lit room. The flash drive with the evidence was lying next to the keyboard. He was preparing to launch his revenge campaign. His face was grim and determined, his eyes burning with cold fury. The first step was to send out the most incriminating materials to Emily's family. He printed some photos and printed out emails. He then anonymously mailed them to her parents and brother. The next morning, he received a call from her mother. Her voice was full of horror and anger. "Garrett, what does this mean?" she screamed. "How could she do that?" "I'm really sorry, Mrs. Smith," he replied calmly. "But it's true. Emily cheated on me." Her father picked up the phone. "Garrett, we will support you. This is unacceptable." "Thank you," he said, feeling grim satisfaction. The next step was her job. Emily has always been proud of her career. Garrett sent compromising materials to her boss and colleagues. He knew it would ruin her professional reputation. A few days later, Emily called him. Her voice was full of tears. "Garrett, please stop this. You've ruined our lives, Emily," he replied coldly. "Now it's your turn." He disconnected the phone and felt satisfied. But that was just the beginning. Julian was next. Garrett used his skills to hack into his personal and business accounts. He found plenty of evidence of financial fraud and irregularities. Having collected all the materials, he anonymously handed them over to the relevant authorities. A few weeks later, there were reports in the local news about the investigation into Julian. His business began to collapse, and his reputation was destroyed. Garrett watched it all with grim satisfaction. He knew his plan was working. One evening, while he was sitting in a cafe, an old friend, Jackson, approached him. "Garrett, what are you doing?" he asked. "You're destroying their lives." Garrett looked at him coldly. "They deserve it, Jackson. They betrayed me." Jackson sighed. "Just be careful. It could backfire on you." "I know what I'm doing," Garrett replied, his voice full of determination. He continued his campaign. Garrett began spreading rumors and compromising information among Emily and Julian's friends and acquaintances. He knew that gossip would spread quickly and get to them. Emily soon became an outcast in her community. Her friends turned away from her. Her colleagues avoided her. Her life turned into a nightmare. Julian didn't escape the consequences either. His business was on the verge of bankruptcy, and his clients and partners began to avoid him. He became the object of ridicule and contempt. Garrett watched with grim satisfaction. He knew that his revenge was almost complete. Garrett was sitting in the office of his lawyer, Mr. Levin. The room was furnished with austere furniture and filled with the smell of leather bindings. Mr. Levin, an elderly man with gray hair and thin-rimmed glasses, was flipping through the papers in front of him. "Garrett, we've gathered enough evidence," Mr. Levin said, looking up at his client. "Are you ready for the next step?" Garrett nodded. "Yes, I'm ready. They must be held accountable." Mr. Levin nodded in response and began to explain the details. "We will file for divorce with the most favorable conditions for you. The house, the car, the financial assets will all be yours." "Thank you, Mr. Levin," Garrett replied. "I want it to be quick." Mr. Levin continued. "We will also provide the court with evidence of Julian's financial fraud. It will speed up the process." The next day, Garrett and Emily met in the courtroom. Emily was pale and her eyes were full of suffering. She wore a modest dress. Her hair was pulled back. Garrett stared at her, his face impassive. He could feel everything boiling inside him, but he knew he had to control himself. The judge, a stern man in a black robe, listened attentively to the testimony of both sides. Mr. Levin presented evidence of treason and financial irregularities. Emily tried to defend herself. Her lawyer presented arguments, but they sounded unconvincing. The judge made a decision. Garrett gets full ownership of the house, car, and all financial assets. Emily, you must leave the property within a week. After the trial, Emily approached Garrett. Her eyes were full of tears. "Garrett, I never thought it would go this far." Garrett stared at her, his face impassive. "It's your choice, Emily. Now you have to live with its consequences." Emily left, her shoulders slumped. Garrett felt like he was boiling inside, but he knew he'd done the right thing. Garrett later met with Mr. Levin to discuss next steps. "We have achieved the maximum result," Mr. Levin said. "You can move on." Garrett nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Levin. I am grateful for your help." Mr. Levin smiled. "This is my job, Garrett. I hope you find your way." Garrett returned home. His house was empty now, but he felt free. He knew that the new challenges were ahead of him, but he was ready for them. Several months have passed. Garrett was completely immersed in his work. He knew it would help him forget about the past. New friends and new interests have appeared in his life. He began to rebuild his life step by step. One evening, Garrett met Mark at a cafe. "How are you holding up?" Mark asked, looking at his friend. Garrett smiled. "Better than before. Life goes on." Mark nodded. "It's good to hear that. You deserve better." They were sitting in a cafe, talking and laughing. Garrett felt that his life was gradually returning to normal. He knew that new opportunities and new horizons were ahead of him. So we have come to the end of this story. Please write your opinion in the comments. We will be interested to know it. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss new, even more exciting stories. We wish you good luck.